Mark Tidd of Webster, New York, and his housemates had a perspective-changing experience. He describes it in this way. An old man unexpectedly showed up at the back door of the house we were renting. Opening the door a few cautious inches, we saw that his eyes were glassy and that his furrowed face glistened with silver stubble. He was clutching a wicker basket containing a few unappealing vegetables. He bid us hello and offered his product for sale. We felt uneasy enough that we made a quick purchase, both to alleviate our pity and our fear. But to our chagrin, he returned again the next week, introducing himself as Mr. Roth, the man who lived in the shack down the road. As our fears subsided, we got close enough to him to realize that it wasn't alcohol, but cataracts that marbleized his eyes. On subsequent visits, he would shuffle in, wearing two mismatched right shoes, and pull out his harmonica. With eyes set on a future glory, he'd puff out old gospel tunes in between conversations about vegetables and religion. On one visit, he exclaimed, "God is so good. I came out of my front door this morning and somebody had left a bag full of shoes and clothing on my porch." "Why, that's wonderful, Mr. Roth," we exclaimed. "We're so happy for you." "And do you know what's even better?" he added. "Just today, I met some people who can use them." It's not often that we equate poverty with generosity, is it? But please note, the poor are among the most giving people that you will ever know. For example, in our last place of residence in California, Anita worked with poor kids, teaching them to read and speak English. Those kids and their parents were some of the most generous persons I have ever known. These parents would each be working 1 to 2 low-paying jobs just to be able to pay the rent and to put bread on the table. And yet, they invited us to their family birthday parties and gatherings. And when we would run into them around the neighborhood, they would offer hellos and gifts and thank yous to Anita in much more abundance than any of the persons or parents of means ever would. And we seriously began to wonder, is it really more blessed to be poor, as the Bible seems to indicate, than it is to be rich? And while that is an honest question, in the end, it is the wrong question. The real question is, how do you and I maintain our generous giving spirit in the midst of accumulating more and more stuff? For it's true that when we start to store things up, our tendency is to become more stingy with them, to hold on a little more tightly to them, and to seek to control how those things are distributed to others. Now, of course, it's important to be responsible and financially prudent and discerning in how we share our many resources. But I ask, in our decision-making and in our giving, are we making distinctions between people? And if so, are those distinctions and our perspectives on them accurate? 6 days before the Passover at Lazarus' house in Bethany provides us with an apt illustration of this. A dinner party is being thrown there for Jesus. Why? Was it because of Jesus' ministry to the downtrodden and the marginalized and the outcast? Maybe. Is it because Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead recently? Perhaps. Or is it because people recognize Jesus as a gifted teacher whose proclamations were in defiance of the authoritarian rules and the oppressive religious leaders. Could be. We do not know for sure. We're much more sure of what happens at that party, for it's an instance that stands out as a unique and definitive moment in Jesus' ministry. He is anointed with perfume by Mary that she bought for, quote unquote, the day of his burial. Now, you don't have that happen to you every day, being anointed by perfume. And yet, it's the statement attributed to Jesus immediately following this anointing that has been most troubling and bothersome to believers down through the centuries. For it has been used, frankly, for ages by folks to argue against the possibility of ever alleviating poverty in our lifetimes and of the utter futility of even trying. For after it is suggested that the money for the perfume could have been used to help the poor, Jesus is quoted as saying, "The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." Now, frankly, that statement sounds arrogant and self-serving. If Jesus did indeed say it, then what in the world could he have meant by it? And what on earth are we to do with it today? Along this line, in my recent reading, I came across an intriguing quotation from one of the 2020 presidential candidate hopefuls the other day. I'm not going to tell you who said this. I'll let you make an educated guess about that. Here's the quote. "The constant tension in a democracy is that those with money will try to capture the government and turn it to their own purposes." The constant tension in a democracy is that those with money will try to capture the government and turn it to their own purposes. Now, if that is true, then in that system, what becomes of the poor and of those who are trapped on the margins? Jesus' controversial statement in John's Gospel, therefore, appears to me to be saying a lot more about the poor and about us than we might think it does. For if, in fact, economically it is true that the poor are always with us, then it becomes incumbent upon us as people, and especially as the people of God, to always and forever, therefore, be ministering to the poor, and to be aggressively addressing the system of inequality and unequal distribution that dominates our culture today. And listen, this is not just my opinion. It is the Bible's opinion. For we all know the account of the early Christians in the book of Acts, how they would sell all their possessions and give the proceeds to the church, so that those proceeds might then be redistributed to all who might have need. Now, we may look back on that practice today, in our market economy, as quaint and nice. But maybe those early believers were onto something. After all, if the poor are always with us, then shouldn't we Christians be busy serving them over and over and over again with our resources? James, who just happened to be Jesus' brother while here on earth, has this to say on the topic. If a person with gold rings and wearing fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, "Have a seat here," while to the one who is poor you say, "Stand over there," or "Sit at my feet," have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Immediately before that, James instructs, "Be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. Religion that God honors is to care for the poor, for widows and orphans, to keep oneself unstained by the world. Now that's not easy, is it? To keep oneself unstained by the world. We might suppose that we can do it by remaining above the world. But that is simply not so. Instead, like Jesus, we need to be in the world, not above it. In the world, where we might witness messy, perfumed anointings. In the world, where we can be connecting with the Mr. Roths, with the compassionate poor and their needs. In the world, yes, perhaps experiencing a democracy where those with money often do seek to manipulate and control others, yet in a world where we who believe in Jesus' ethic will hold them, us, accountable for those deeds. You see, my friends, we dare not hold ourselves above the world or even beside it. On the contrary, we must enter into it as Jesus did. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. He was correct. For indeed, Jesus is no longer physically here with us today. He's not. But the poor, they are. They are. So let's minister to them. At the same time, let us Christians work on fixing the inequitable system that we have allowed to proliferate on our globe. What can you do? Ask yourself. What can I do? It might start simply with doing some reading, with educating ourselves to the depth of the problem we face in our culture today, with changing our mind and our perspective so that we don't fall into the trap that James describes in our reading for today. That is, that we don't want to be the person who forever looks at himself in the mirror, determining perhaps to do good things while we're there in front of the mirror, and then forgets what's important when he or she goes out into the world. Instead, James advises, forget looking in mirrors. Forget it. Instead, he says, look at the law of freedom and liberty. Focus intently on that, on the perfect law of justice. And make a difference in this world by your actions. Don't merely be a hearer, be a doer, he exhorts, recognizing your own prejudices and your own ingrained perspectives, even as you perform God's work in the world. Because deeply ingrained perspectives and learned viewpoints can be challenging, difficult to change. We may not readily realize how we even see things differently from others, or how they see things differently than we do. Case in point, missionary and linguist Fraser of Lisuland in northern Burma, modern-day Myanmar, was the first to translate the Bible into the Lisu, that's L-I-S-U, language. After doing so, he left a young man in charge of teaching the local people to read it. When Fraser returned 6 months later, this is a true story, he found 3 students and the young instructor seated around a small table, with the scriptures opened up in front of the instructor. What Fraser found incredible was that when the students each read, they left the Bible right where it was. The student on the left of the teacher read it sideways. The student on the right of the teacher also read it sideways, only from the other direction. And the student across from the teacher, you guessed it, read it upside down. Precisely because they had always occupied the same chairs, that's how they had learned to read. And that's how they came to interpret the written language. Now, before we start to scoff at those folks or ridicule them, when was the last time you changed seats? Not just here in this sanctuary, but in life. When's the last time we made a conscious change in order to gain a new perspective? Say, through the eyes of the marginalized in our culture, through the eyes of the young, or the old, or the marginalized or the poor, or the unemployed. When have we recently challenged ourselves with a new way of looking at things, rather than gazing into the same old mirror every single day? But instead, getting face to face with the very people and the related people projects that need our attention. When was it for me? When was it for you? For remember, my friends, the real poor people in our culture today may actually be us. When we fail to step out and risk and change our perspective on a world that God has redeemed and called us to serve. It may be you and I when we choose to merely listen to the word without doing anything about it. Yes, indeed, the poor old Mr. Roths of this world may certainly have something to teach us. Amen.